Okay, so now we'll start chapter 50. So, as it says here, this is the interactions, ecology interactions between organisms. So that means the same species of organisms as well as other organisms, and the environment that they live in. And so therefore we take an ecosystem and divide it into two categories. Non-living components, we call those the abiotic factors of the ecosystem. And then the living components, what do you think you call them? Biotic factors. All right. Oops, sorry. And so we're going to look at these two factors and how they interact, and we're going to focus on how they affect and limit the distribution of species. So distribution of species is where the species live. So for instance, that could be the distribution of them along the whole earth. So some organisms live in only certain areas of the earth, and not in other areas. Or it could be within a smaller unit of land, that the organism itself doesn't take up the whole area but lives in just a small portion. And so what kinds of things limit and therefore affect that distribution? So some biotic factors can do that. So biotic factors that affect the distribution of organisms may include interactions with other species. So, for instance, a specific species may be territorial, so therefore they keep other organisms from their territory. And so that's going to limit the distribution of the other species, because the other species isn't going to come into that area because of this territory that this other species is marking. And so, so that's an example of one organism affecting the distribution of another organism. Predation can also limit the distribution of organisms. So, for instance, predators may limit the distribution of their prey in a particular area. Competition can limit the distribution by, if organisms are competing for the same resources, then you'll have, that'll affect where those organisms can be found based upon where those resources are. And then other biotic factors like parasites, which are organisms that live within another organism. So they need that organism for food and so on. Pathogen is anything that causes diseases, as well as the presence of pollinators and food species. So pollinator, a pollinator is can be anything that takes the pollen from one flower to another flower. And therefore, remember, the pollen has the sperm for the plant, and goes and fertilizes an egg in another flower. And so pollinators can limit the distribution of what they pollinate, the flowers. So for instance, a flower is not going to live in an area where thrive in an area where there's no pollinators to pollinate the flowers. And so therefore the presence of those pollinators kind of dictate where that is found. So a specific case, this is a graph that shows one instance where it says an herbivore limiting the distribution of a food species. So we're looking at two herbivores here. A sea urchin and a limpet. And so that's what they look like. This graph here, what it's showing you is they studied an area in the ocean off of Sydney, Australia, and looked at the sea urchins and the limpets and their effect on the seaweed that was growing in the ocean. And so if you look at this graph, they're looking at the percentage of seaweed cover. So how much is covered with seaweed, and therefore directly talking about seaweed growth. And then the x-axis is time, just under 2 years here, from August of 1982 to February of 1984. And they did an experiment showing, trying to figure out what plays a role in the seaweed cover. So if we look at these two lines down here, on yours it's kind of hard to see that for my red line, that's the control. Both the urchins and the limpets were present, and they found that when both of them live in the ocean, we had very little seaweed. So then they wanted to see, well, what's actually controlling the seaweed? Is it those two organisms? Is it one of those organisms? And so on. And so what they did is it's a little experiment. So the green line represents the data that they collected, where they took an area of the ocean and they put only the sea urchins. So they only, the limpets were removed, so they left the sea urchin. And when they left the sea urchin, notice here that the line is still kind of right along that control line, so very little seaweed growth. Then they took another area where they only removed the urchins, and so when they removed the urchins, that means that they left the limpets. When they left the limpets and removed the urchins, look at here, the seaweed grows. And then when both of them were removed, so neither one of them are present, the seaweed grew even more. So according to this, which organism has the most effect on the growth of the seaweed? The sea urchin should be the one that has that you should be thinking has the most effect. Can somebody tell me if you were to write evidence for that, what you would say? What's the evidence on this graph that sea urchins have the most effect on seaweed growth? Yeah.
You would cite the, not sure which line is actually the control and which one's the...
The red is the control and the green is the limit.
You would cite both the green and blue lines saying that in the case where only limpets were removed, there was basically no significant growth of seaweed, but when the urchins were removed, it dramatically changed and increased.
That's right. All right, absolutely. And so, so this is a case where one organism and its growth and distribution in the ecosystem that it's a part of, in this ocean ecosystem, is directly related to the presence of another organism. So if you took the seaweeds out of the of that environment, or took the sea urchins out of the environment, then the seaweed it changes the distribution of the seaweed, and so therefore it's limited by that sea urchin. All right. All right, so that's your biotic factors. Abiotic factors can also limit distribution and affect the distribution of organisms. So we see this with climate a lot. So part of climate is temperature. So temperature is an example of one abiotic factor that can affect the distribution. We see that globally. You know, you have only certain organisms that live in really warm climates. Those same organisms that have adaptations to live in warm climates are not found in cooler